But in any case, Arne, you said we were having sort of a soft landing in terms of the oil market. Well, I can assure you we're not having a soft landing when it comes to regulatory affairs. We're only in for a ride, and the ride is fast, and it's also complex. So, okay, now I'm just struggling here with this. Anyways. Yes, I used to work for Danish shipping, the equivalent to Norway's Rederiforbund that I think many of you know. And not only was I involved in decarbonization, but I was also environmental affairs, and last but not least, safety. So anything in between piracy, migrants at sea, etc. So I'm also following closely now from a more personal interest the events that goes on in the Red Sea. I'm going to be giving you an overview of the regulation or the regulatory landscape that our industry is facing. I mean, yes, now I represent the bunker industry, so it's not because I'm, still in my past role, but any regulation that, when it comes to fuels that hits the shipping industry, also affects the bunker industry. That's why I still say we. First of all, EU regulation, as you all know, the EU ETS came into force just a couple of weeks ago. And then the FuelEU Maritime that will kick in a year from now. And then I will look a little bit at IMO, the GHG strategy, CII, and the midterm measures. And last but not least, try to look a little bit into the crystal ball, like how do we at Bunker Holdings see the future in terms of fuel solutions, before I pass it on to my colleague who will then do a deep dive into biofuels. So I think you can see this today as a bit of a funnel where we started up in the broad political perspective with the US elections. Then we moved on to the oil market, and now we start to narrow our focus into the regulation for the industry, and then we're going to end up with one of the fuel type solutions. So just a few words on Bunker Holding and our role in this industry. See, we're not a fuel producer. We do have physical supplies around the world, but mostly we're in the trader business. And what we do is basically we connect the dots between US customers and suppliers. And this especially is interesting when we are talking about the alternative fuel markets, because the producers, they're not used to deal with the shipping industry. There are so many particularities around the shipping industry that the fuel producers are not used to dealing with. And that's where a company like Bunker Holding and our sister companies come into the picture. So this is basically how we see ourselves as a facilitator for the transition. We have chosen as a strategic, made a strategic decision that we as a bunker trading company want to be part of the green transition and to facilitate the transition. That's why we also pay a lot of attention to whatever regulatory measure is coming into play. This is what I just said, just an overview of where we're present, both in trading offices, but also as physical locations. So now let's move on to the regulatory overview. I'm going to be focusing on the regulations that has to do with fuel, or where you can basically be compliant by taking your fuel consumption or be forced to take your fuel consumptions or the type of fuel that you consume into consideration. So if we look at the left side, those are the recently implemented regulations, as I mentioned, the EU ETS, the CII. I'm going to come back to them and go a little bit more into detail with each one of them. The EEXI, I'm not going to go into that one. That's a technical measure, basically requiring the ship owner to put a engine power limitation or a shaft power limitation, or to install energy efficiency devices to do a retrofit on their vessels. You cannot be compliant with the EEXI based on what the fuel you burn. It's a technical design measure. That's why I'm not going to go into more detail on that one. Last but not least, the SEEMP, we have all these funny operations in this industry, is the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan that you're required to have on board, and it's also your tool when it comes to compliance with the CII. I'm going to come back to that as well. Then on the right side, we have the upcoming regulations, the FuelEU Maritime, and then last but not least, the IMO midterm measures that are to be negotiated between now and the end of 25. The IMO has set quite a busy work plan for themselves, quite an ambitious one, I would say, to basically adopt two measures. On the one hand, an economic one, and on the other hand, a technical one, a global fuel standard. I'm going to come back to that again. If you see in the middle, I've written fleet/vessel emissions, because some of these regulations are measured on fleet level, and others are targeted individual vessels, which only adds to the complexity. This one, I'm pretty sure you've seen it many times before, and you're also familiar with basically the main characteristics of the ETS requirements. The scope, the type of vessel, the phasing in, the types of vessel, size of vessel, the geographical scope. Yes, as I said, the phase-in timeline for the percentage of emissions to be paid or to be covered by EUAs. And then last but not least, also the greenhouse gas scope. These are the things set in stone. They are agreed by the European Union's political system. So when you, and I'm sure you've also seen this during the fall, all of a sudden there were a group of southern European countries, I'm not going to mention who all of a sudden said, well, you know, maybe this is this is not a good idea. Maybe we should postpone the entering into force of ETS for shipping. Funny enough, those countries were the same sitting in the European Council actually negotiating this. So, you know, it ain't going to happen. But this has also been a large part of the industry's attitude to the ETS and other regulatory measures, like sitting a little bit backwards and then say, well, it's not going to happen. Don't worry. Nothing's going to happen. Well, I think everybody now has realized, especially here in Europe, that yeah, it's here to stay. We still see, and that's again working globally, we still have, you know, clients in the Far East, South America, calling Europe from time to time who are still like, ET, what? So that just still leaves a lot of, you know, explanations to do, and there are still preparatory work to be done. I know here in Norway you're big in the offshore sector, so it's probably of particular interest to you, the phasing in and the taking into consideration of the offshore sector as well, especially starting with reporting to the MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification scheme of the EU. Yes. Briefly, very, very briefly, the ETS system has been around for, since 2005 for the major, the heavy energy industries. And in 2012, aviation was included into the ETS. And I think that's a little bit, you can see now that shipping may be suffering a little bit from entering into an already existing system, already well-functioning system that was definitely not designed for the shipping sector with all, and you know much more about this than I do, with all its different, you know, types of ownerships, chartering, responsibility, moving around, etc. The industry itself is a difficult animal to fit into the ETS system, and I'm going to come back to then why that has put so much more preparatory work on the industry itself. Anne touched a little bit upon the price of EUAs. Here it's way too high, not at least in this price example. Right now it's like 65 euros for one EUA. One EUA allows you to emit 1 ton of CO2. But, and I'm going to come back to that, remember, the ETS is not the only regulatory measure. Basically, you could be paying your way out without doing anything. At a certain point, also depending on the price, at a certain point, the business case would probably not be very good anymore. But until a certain point, you would be able to just, you know, buy your EUAs and do nothing with your fleet. But you have the FuelEU Maritime actually starting to set requirements for the fuel that you burn on board. So I'm going to come back to that, why it's actually quite smart and quite effective by the Commission or the EU to have, you know, a system and put a system in place that both puts a price on carbon, but also sets requirement to what kind of fuel you're actually burning. Here we've just done a price example. As I said, the price is way too high right now. That can easily change from some of the variables that Arne explained to you. But the most important thing is to say, well, if we start by only 40% for this year, it's not going to be too bad. But when we hit 26, it's 100% coverage, and that makes quite a difference in terms of the price for your for what you emit and your operation just in general. So, moving into what I started to say a little bit about before, how this really, has caused probably some headaches around the ship owners' offices in Europe and also outside Europe. There are two types of accounts here, an operator holding account and a trading account. Trading account is basically anybody can open a trading account and then go in and trade these EUAs allowances. The operator holding account is the one that also has to do with enforcement. And that's why this was not part of the actual regulation. These have been part of sort of the implementing part that the Commission sits and works out with the member states after the big political framework, the ETS agreement, had been adopted. Then all the details, but these details are quite important for the ship owners, knowing how to comply, knowing how to prepare. So opening an operator account, and remember who is the legal entity when it comes to ETS. That's the dock holder, just like the ISM code, same definition. But why, and this was a huge discussion during the negotiations, why is it not the polluter pays? The polluter who should be the legal entity, i.e. in many cases the charter. Well, can you imagine how many legal entities the EU would all of a sudden have to deal with? Some sort of Brazilian mining company that doesn't really exist, or something else. It will be completely impossible to enforce. And that's why, also lobbied by some of my colleagues in my previous role, that we said, well, we need to have one point of entry when it comes to enforcement. And that's why the dock holder was chosen. After this, it has been decided that at the end of the day, it is the ship owner. If nothing has been declared, then it's the ship owner who ultimately holds the responsibility. Can you imagine all the Greek owners that basically, own very few vessels and charter them out all the time? They were like totally up in arms about this. The German dentist, for some reason, it's very popular in Germany. If you're a dentist, to invest in Merchant vessels. Can you imagine them actually being involved in this, the EUA trading, the data collection, the reporting to the MRB, the verification process, etc.? No. So it has been decided that each company needs to have a letter signed by the ship owner and the ship manager. I guess many of you in this room, or at least you're familiar with third-party management. Many of the ship owners will have this delegated to their third-party manager, the ship manager, and there needs to be a document signed by both the manager and the ship owner, clearly stating that the third-party manager has now resumed the responsibility. If that has not been provided to the union registry or the national authority, then the ultimate responsibility falls back on the owner. So these are some of the things that really you need to be aware of and need to have that in place before we already now it's entering into force, but as we move along and before you actually have to transfer the EUAs by September next year. So, contractual implications, yes, they are definitely there as well, because who will pay for this? And then I'm going back to the polluter pays discussion, because of course the ship owner, if you have chartered your vessel out, you're not responsible or don't have any influence on the speed, the cargo, the route, or anything else. That's why, of course, you want to pass on that cost to the charter party. Well, BIMCO, I'm sure you're all familiar with that organization, have agreed on some clauses that are available for both time charters, voyage charters, but also to govern the relationship between a ship owner and a ship manager. Because as you all know, a ship manager doesn't do anything unless the ship owner calls, and the ship manager doesn't do anything unless the ship owner pays for it. So of course, if the ship manager, if the responsibility is delegated to the ship manager, there needs to be, both an obligation for him to actually be compliant, because otherwise it's going to be the ship owner at the end of the day who will be fined. But the ship owner, on the other hand, also needs to actually provide the manager with the financial means to be compliant. Here, I'm just showing you some different examples of what needs to be in place between the different stakeholders involved in this, and ultimately the cargo owner as well, if the cost is to be passed on to the cargo owner. And just to repeat myself, there are now contracts or clauses to be used on a voluntary basis, and they can also be adjusted for the specific type of the operation. This can be a huge deal, especially for smaller companies, because it also requires you have a lot of financial means that you may not, all of a sudden you need to have money right there, liquidity that you didn't have to have before that, which is also why, and we haven't talked about that, but this is also why GRM is actually able to provide this and also do a large part of this work. Let's move on to the FuelEU Maritime. As I said, yes, ETS, you could basically, in theory, just pay your way out. But from 25, you're going to be hit by FuelEU Maritime. If we look at the scope, it's basically to a large extent the same as the ETS in terms of the geographical scope, ship type, ship size, etc. There is one really interesting part. You can be compliant not on an individual vessel per vessel. You don't have to. You can choose to either bank, pool, or borrow your surplus. That means that if we take the pooling mechanism first, that's basically fleet-based compliance. I'm gonna go through this one so that you actually know what you're going to be compliant with. But let's say you have a group of vessels. It doesn't have to be within the same company. That means the smaller companies can actually go together in the pool. You're only required to be under the same DOC holder, because again, the legal entity is the dock holder, right? And that could be the owner, or it can be the third-party manager, as I've explained before. You can then go together and say, well, okay, we have an incentive here to actually have, okay, let's, the easiest example is like, okay, one methanol, purely green methanol-driven ship. I only know one in the world who can do this, sailing around here in the Northern Baltic Sea. But let's say, okay, we're going to go together and have this, we use this as a pool to make the rest of the vessels within this pool compliant. What does that mean? It means that you have the freedom to actually direct your investments towards the ships where it makes the most sense. And you're not forced necessarily to make investments on, let's say, older vessels or vessels where it just doesn't make sense to do it. So I think this is a really important option to look into, especially if you're a bigger company among your own fleet, or if you're a smaller company, then look to pool with other companies as well. Then banking and pooling is basically you can then save some of your surplus for the year after, or you can also borrow it from the previous year. And then we've talked a lot about and then we're going to come back to that with biofuel as the immediate solution, because it's a drop-in fuel. You can burn it on existing vessels without much modification to the engine, the pipes, etc. But of course, the EU has an ambition to drive the transition towards renewable fuels, and that's why there is a requirement to have 2% of the RNFBO use from 34. There will be some checkpoints on the way there. I'm going to show you in the next slide. And then last but not least, we've also had questions from many clients saying, Is it really necessary with the price spread between, well, biofuels and real SFO? Is it really necessary to be compliant? What's the fine? You see there, 2,400 euros. So it's not insignificant. Plus, further down the road, there is also an option for a member state to actually deny the vessel into its port or expel the vessel as well if you have more than one non-conformity with the regulation. So let's move to the right side here. You basically the FuelEU Maritime requires you to lower your GHG intensity in the fuel stepwise. So 2%, 6%, going all the way down to 80% by 2050. Now, if any of you are still awake, then you will be like, I thought the EU had the ambition to be carbon neutral or to be in zero by 2050. So how come that's only 80%? Well, that's because the FuelEU Maritime and the ETS is part of a whole legislative package targeting all industries in Europe, meaning that shipping is considered to be one of the hard-to-abate sectors. So there are other sectors that will deliver more. That's why we have 80% here. We've also put a little bit of, where you see the fuel types. How can you actually be compliant? How can you fulfill the FuelEU Maritime requirements? And as you see, LNG and a B30 blended with VLSFO, you're actually compliant all the way to 2030.
40.
Sorry? 40. Sorry, I said sorry, I meant 40. Sorry, I said 30. 40. Whereas if you have, let's say, fossil methanol, gray methanol, you're not even compliant of today. And the reason why, and this is incredibly important, is because the FuelEU Maritime applies the well-to-wake perspective. So the whole production phase, the transport, is also taken into the consideration and are calculated as part of the emissions, not just what you emit from your vessel, from the combustion on board the vessel. So that's why you need to take this into consideration. Here it is explained the specific difference between the two perspectives. There's been a lot of discussion, and many parts of the industry are very much against applying the well-to-wake perspective because they thought it was unfairly treated, because how can a ship owner do anything about this part over here, what happens at land, etc. But it's not to punish anybody, it's simply to have the full transparency so that you know what you're making your investments into, and that we don't get locked into some sort of production path that at the end of the day may end up, because methanol could look really great just saying methanol, right? But if it's fossil or gray methanol, you end up actually emitting more than you were supposed to. This shows the difference. You can see here a breakdown of when you do both well to tank to wake. And then also include the other greenhouse gases, which is another difference between the ETS and the FuelEU Maritime. That in the ETS, the CH4 and NO2 is only included in the MRV to be reported on, but you don't have to pay your EUAs for these greenhouse gas emissions until 26. They are counting in FuelEU Maritime from day one. So here you basically see how you can be deceived if you don't take the full well-to-wake perspective into consideration. Yep. I'm going to speed up because I think time is running. I promised you to come back a little bit on how the EU is trying to incentivize the uptake of e-fuels. And this is by setting requirements for the RFNBO, with a checkpoint in 2031, and see if it's above or below 1% within the fuel mix. Then, if it's below, then there will be a sub-target of the 2% coming into force in 2034. That's why, we as fuel traders, we need to be aware and also following and doing a lot of work on these e-fuels, because we know somewhere down the line, this will probably become, if not, it's already there, the demand, then it will become a legislative requirement. So we're going to leave the EU now. And I promise you, you'll get the slides afterwards. I know it's pretty heavy stuff, so don't despair. There's a lot of information on them, I know. Let's move to the IMO, and I'm sure you've all seen this, or at least you have heard of the revised strategy that was adopted in July last summer, where basically, in typical IMO lingo, we're going to go hit zero by or around 2050. When it says by or around, it has to do with big or high politics between the member states. Like, this is why the Chinese are happy, because they wanted 2060. That's what their national GHG or decarbonization plan says. They're going to be carbon neutral by 2060. Europe, they wanted 2040 and others. So by or around, that's basically the compromise, the beauty of the IMO lingo, so to say. Then we have some quite interesting checkpoints in 2040 of a 70% absolute reduction, and we have a 20% absolute reduction target for 2030. And then we still have the good old 40% relative reduction target that was already in the strategy from 2018. The relative reduction target is for 40%, and then we have a new funny little thing of a 5% near zero or zero energy share by 2030. Again, this is a political wording in order to set the framework for the two midterm measures that I mentioned in the beginning, the two midterm measures that are now to be negotiated, to be adopted by the end of 2025, coming into force by 2027. Yep, but we already have this, and I know a lot of people hate the CII. I've heard so much critique of the CII system. This is the carbon intensity indicator. It's like when you have your kitchen equipment, your refrigerator, you basically get a rating. It's rated A, B, C, D, E, depending on how energy efficient it is. It's basically the same thing that we do for the ships, apart from the fact that this is operational efficiency. So you can have a state-of-the-art, well-built vessel, but run really badly. It could be for various reasons, bad seafare, or it could simply be because the customer requires, that you go full speed and you hit the port at a certain time, or you change your route or something, or you're hit by bad weather. It could be all kinds of things that influences this. But basically, your rating is based on your operational performance during the previous year. So what is it good for? Is it like comparing apples and pears? Yes, probably it is. But on the other hand, this is the first time that IMO is regulating operational efficiency and actually giving the ship owners an incentive to operate the most efficient way. That is a huge step forward, because so far IMO has only been regulated on a technical basis, never operational efficiency, only technical efficiency, and now moving into a little bit more of the fuel types as well. So just very, very briefly, C is a compliant vessel. A and B is over compliance. D and E is a non-compliant vessel. It's shown here in a different way. So are there any consequences if you have a non-compliant vessel? Well, see, that's one of the things that I'm always struggling a little bit with, as opposed to the EU, where you saw with the FuelEU Maritime, there is a fine. There is a fine as well with the ETS if you're non-compliant there. There is really no consequence if you aren't compliant with your CII rating, apart from the fact that if you have a D rating 3 consecutive years, then you need to put in a corrective action plan into your SEEMP. That was the one I mentioned in the very beginning. The management plan you have on board, where you basically describe how to operate this vessel in the most efficient way. You need to put in a corrective action plan in order to get your statement of compliance from your classification society. If you have an E rating, you only have 1 year, then you have to put in a corrective action plan the following year. So you can say this is pretty soft implementation. Will it then be used, as a commercial issue? There will probably be some of the customers, especially in the liner segment and others, where they will say, well, we will only have, A or B vessels or something like that. But then they also just have to remember, the rating is only as good as the vessel was operated the previous year. So there's no guarantee that you can have the same rating this year. So it's more about, if I were a customer saying I only want to have my goods on A vessels, then I would, enter into some contractual agreements with the ship owner saying, well, this ship damn well better stay as an A vessel, and you need to operate it so that it remains an A vessel. We're getting towards the end. Yes. Can I say also, I said I was only going to talk about the EU and IMO. I have to just mention the COP28 in Dubai as well. Shipping is not part of the negotiations at the UNFCCC. It's mandated to the IMO, just like it is for aviation, to ICAO, which is the equivalent to IMO for aviation. But I think one of the things that came out of COP28 was a clear signal of transition away from fossil fuels. It could have been a stronger wording, phasing out fossil fuels. I know that there are several countries, including my own, that really wanted that. But that's the first time ever. Yes, the Saudis, they were not happy. But on the other hand, I think this will somehow then be reflected when we meet at IMO this spring to continue the negotiations, that this will be mentioned again and again, that the world in general has started to commit itself to a transition away from fossil fuels. How about the US? Coming back to if the little guy, not little, the big guy with the orange hair, the orange guy, if he wins the election, what will then happen? Well, first of all, the US is probably going to be withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Then secondly, at IMO, the US delegation, I was there as an advisor to the Danish delegation. I did that for 13 years, so I've watched it all through the years. During the Trump administration, you had a US delegation basically just sitting. I think they had a mandate of being against everything. But they're clever, and they really hated. You could see they were suffering really badly. So what they did from time to time was to take the floor and then come a little bit of a procedural argument, prolonging the negotiations, but not really, putting anything to an end. I'm afraid we're going to see that again, and that will be a disaster because during the Biden administration, we've seen a U.S. completely back into the game. Actually, Norway, the U.S., and Denmark, they are heading the mission innovation collaboration for shipping, setting up green corridors, all kinds of really, really interesting projects, and we've seen a U.S. really contributing to the negotiations at IMO, and I'm really afraid that will not make it easier to reach agreement on the midterm measures. I know I'm going to speed up now because otherwise I'm running out of time. So just a little bit coming back to the fuel types. Now this is the way, if we look into the crystal ball, and I think, if anybody had the answer, and we've been asked so many times, so what's the winner of the future? What fuel is definitely the winner? It's so difficult to say because there's so many variables that interfere here. One thing is for sure, and I'm going to explain that, and Gunnar will then elaborate, that biofuel, for various reasons, will be the immediate solution for now if you need to complying with FuelEU Maritime, etc. I'm going to come back to that, because otherwise this is basically how we perceive the future. This could very well change, especially as I showed you before, the 5% zero/near zero fuels to be part of it, to be the energy mix for the global fleet. Will that mean that some member states will all of a sudden, get into a huge, effort of producing e-fuels or whatever? That's what it's going to take, because as of now, it is not possible with the production capacity, the green feedstock from wind and solar energy that we have today. But is it impossible? No, it's not, but we have very little time before we hit 2030, so things are going to really start to get going now if we're going to change this outlook. So why am I saying that the biofuel, we definitely believe in biofuel as the immediate solution now? Well, if you look at the vessels that are underwater today, I mean, you can think the numbers speak for themselves, how many of them are actually running on traditional fuels or order book LNG. But LNG, you cannot just switch to blend in biofuel. So again, depending on the price development on LNG, which again has something to do with what Arne showed us about the oil market in general, then we definitely see here that ships running on traditional fossil fuels are going to be underwater for many years. You all know that a vessel built today will be in the water 20, 25 years from now. And that's why we believe that biofuel as a blend-in will be a solution going forward. Not to mention, if we move towards the e-fuels, there will still be a need for pilot fuel. Could also be biofuel. I'm going to really speed up now and then leave it to Gunnar. This is again just the way we again see the future when we reach 2030. We believe that 20% of the global fuel mix will be from an alternative fuels, and we believe that biofuels will play a key role, as I said. So, and with that, we've reached the end, and then I would like to skip the floor to my colleague Gunnar. But if you have any questions, I'm also happy.